Learn next week. Actually, next week. I'm just going to leave that there. No, next week, Lord willing, the plan is that we will not be having Ezekiel class because Gardner Hall will be with us. He can set up wherever he wants to, and you guys better sit close. You can get away with it with me, but not with a guest speaker. In 2 weeks' time, we'll get back to Ezekiel. Scott's going to lead us in prayer. Tonight, we're going to cover 23, 24, and 25. And I'm going to say some things just to kind of connect some dots and set up the text for tonight. But let's begin with prayer, and Scott will lead us in that.
Our Father God, thank you for today. Thank you for the rain and the snow and for the sunshine. Thank you for blessing us with your mercy and your kindness. Father, thank you for life. The life specifically we have through Jesus Christ. We're so grateful we get to meet tonight in comfort and in safety and study your word together as the body. Father, please bless our study. Please bless Taylor. Please bless all the teachers and the students as they look at your word. Please implant your word into our hearts and help us to practice it throughout the week and throughout the rest of our life. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
All right, Ezekiel 23 through 25. We obviously, the first part of Ezekiel is a part that has a lot of very heavy teaching, heavy prophecy, a lot of things that would have been, as uncomfortable as they are for us to hear. Imagine what it would have been like to be in exile, hearing all of this judgment that's on the horizon for the city that, the place that you love perhaps more than any other place in the world, the place that you're hoping, you're going to get to go back to. Keep this in mind too. We haven't necessarily said this, but a lot of these exiles, as they heard these prophecies about what was going to happen to Jerusalem, realized that for many of them, they would not have been able to go back. 70 years is going to be the time frame. So for most of the people here in Ezekiel, they're not ever going to see Jerusalem again, which would have made it that much more heartbreaking to hear, all the things that you saw when you left Jerusalem. Not only are those things not going to be there, it's not going to be anything like you remember it being, but it's going to be completely devastated and broken down and broken into. It would have been incredibly, I think, traumatic for them to hear these things. But for all of the heaviness of this, and I think, we study through the prophets and sometimes we wonder, we're looking for the hope in the prophets. Remember that in this part of Ezekiel, Ezekiel's doing two things. The first thing is he is repeatedly emphasizing that when God brings the judgment on Jerusalem and on Judea, he's doing it to accomplish a purpose. It's so that they will know that he's the Lord. That's a phrase that we've emphasized that comes up over and over and over in Ezekiel again. The point is that God wants to be known. He wants his people to know him, and not just superficially. I think that's one of the key takeaways for us in this, is that God's not content just to have people who know of him or know some things about him or have a surface level familiarity with him. If that's really all we know of him, if we know him kind of on the same level that Judah knew him, that's not sufficient. That's not what he's after. He's after deep knowledge. He's after a relationship. He's after this kind of relationship that he describes as a marriage in several places in Ezekiel. So what God is doing in this judgment, as devastating as it sounds and looks and is, the point is that he's trying to teach the world who he is. He's trying to remind his people who he is. The other thing is that God is using this punishment and these consequences to discipline his people, because on the other side of this, he's bringing out a remnant. And what he's going to do in this judgment and in this disciplinary period is he's going to change the hearts of his people, so that the remnant that comes out of captivity isn't going to go back to the same sins that they knew for so long. They're not going to go back to idolatry. They're not going to go back pursuing alliances with all these other nations. So God is using this discipline so that he can create a new heart and a new spirit within his people, so that the people that come back will genuinely love him. And that's an important thing to remember. We are coming to the part in Ezekiel where the tone is going to shift. We're going to get away from tonight the judgment against Jerusalem. There's going to be 2 chapters of that. But then Ezekiel's going to start judging, bringing oracles against the nations. And when that section in chapters 25 through 32 finishes, the tone of his message is going to start to change to one of hope. Now that God is destroying the city, is bringing about the judgment, what is the point of that, and what is this pointing to? Where's the hope in that? So keep that in mind. All right, let's take a look at chapter 23, and what we have here is another history lesson. This is one of those places in Ezekiel. Chapter 16 was one, chapter 20 was another, where God basically gives a picture of Israel's history. In chapter 23, he tells it from the perspective of 2 sisters, Aholah and Aholibah. And Aholah represents Samaria. Aholibah represents Jerusalem. What was the significance of those 2 places? Why were they important? Tanya?
Well, Samaria was kind of like the capital of Israel, and Jerusalem was kind of like the capital of Judah.
Good. Yeah, both of them are capital cities. So you have a representation of the whole nation, but I think specifically kind of a picture of the sins of the leaders, the government, the kings, those who were in positions of power. So as God's telling this history of Aholah and Aholibah, what kinds of things come up in their history? Like, what are some of the things that God accuses them of doing or says that they had been guilty of? Bruce?
Well, he describes them as sisters here, and sort of like his wives, and their adulterous relationship with the nations around them, with all the idolatry, adopting and going up to these other nations and forsaking God as their one.
Okay, good. In very graphic language, he tells the story of their youth, their betrothal to him. He takes them as his wives, and what they're doing from very early on is engaging in this idolatry. But you notice he doesn't really describe it in terms of idolatry. He describes it in terms of adultery, sexual sin. And it's very graphically described. I want to ask you guys, why do you think God portrays, often in the prophets, certainly in Ezekiel, why do you think God portrays idolatry as adultery or as prostitution or harlotry or some sort of sexual sin? What do you think we should take away from that comparison? Why doesn't he just call them out for the idolatry? Why do you think he uses that figure of speech or that connection? Tanya?
Because I think it's something mankind can understand.
Okay.
I mean, a man who has an adulterous wife, or a wife that has a man that messes around, it's heartbreaking.
Right.
And even though you might try to reconcile, the trust is not there.
Okay, good. So when you have a group of people who have been engaging in this pattern of sin, and they're to the point where it's not really bothering them, how do you get them to see this from your perspective? How does God get them to see their sin from his perspective? You describe it in some of the most painful terms that any of us could ever experience, by talking about the faithfulness of a marriage and demonstrating to them that their idolatry, their pursuit of other nations, of other alliances, of other security, is nothing short of unfaithfulness to him. It is heartbreaking, and I think it's intended to be so. Very good. Bruce?
I was thinking also the passage in Jeremiah 2 where he says that his people have committed 2 evils. Bad enough they left me, but then went to something that was far inferior. Okay. And that's what they've done here. I mean, God is God, and they not only abandoned him, but then went to something that was far less.
Okay, good. And God's going to point out, I think, in many ways how because they sought hope in all of these lesser things, the consequence was that the lesser things were going to come back and bite them. Those peoples that they committed adultery with, so to speak, were going to be the very people that came back and punished them, that God used to punish them. Carol, do you have a hand up?
Idolatry has been their weakness all along, just like lust is
Right.
a weakness.
Good. And certainly it goes along with the picture in Scripture of God viewing this relationship as a marriage relationship. Whether it's Israel in the Old Testament or the parallel to God's people, to Christians in the New Testament, he wants us to see his perspective on this, and I think this is integral to that. Now, going back to something that Carol mentioned, this is a problem that has been around for a long time. In chapter 23, where did the problem start? As you were reading through that history lesson, where did the problem of idolatry or adultery, where did it seem to originate? Egypt. Okay, good. Why do you think God goes back to Egypt? Do you think that was because that was the first place idolatry showed up in the Old Testament among God's people? Or do you think there's a specific reason that Egypt is kind of where this started for them? Alan?
The time of Egypt and coming out of it and going to Sinai was sort of the, say, betrothal and the marriage standpoint of when God took a nation bride to himself, and so he would go back to this point. It wasn't that, obviously there was idolatry even before that, before Egypt, as you read the book of Genesis, that plagued them, but as a nation, that's his bride, that's where that started.
Good. So think about the significance of that. I mean, basically, as soon as God married this nation, this is already happening. And it was happening before God took them and married them. I mean, I think to Alan's point, I think that I agree with that. The idea is that it started in Egypt because that's where they were birthed as a nation. But if you trace the lineage of God's people back in Genesis, how many times did idolatry show up? I mean, the place that God called Abram from, Ur of the Chaldeans, was an idolatrous culture. When Jacob took his wives and left Laban, remember Rachel steals her father's idols and takes them with her. I mean, so idolatry was there in their camp the whole time. Joshua, when he leads the people into the promised land and he's about to die, remember what he does is he leaves a choice with the people. You guys decide who you're going to serve this day. You can serve the gods on the other side of the river if you want to. You can serve the gods of your fathers. But the implication is that their fathers who had been delivered by Jehovah were serving other gods. And Joshua, of course, says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The point is, this idolatry had always been a problem. And I think there's a powerful lesson in that for us in chapter 23. The ultimate, I mean, this inability to ever deal with the root of the problem kept coming back and coming back and coming back and haunting Aholah and Aholibah both. You notice that in both of their stories, look at verse 8, in the case of Samaria or Israel, the northern kingdom, she did not forsake her harlotries from the time in Egypt, for in her youth men had lain with her, and they handled her virgin bosom and poured out their lust on her. So that was the northern kingdom. Same thing with the southern kingdom in verse 19. Yet she multiplied her harlotries, remembering the days of her youth when she played the harlot in the hand of Egypt. The problem was, because they had started down this road of sin and never really gotten away from it, it kept causing problems. And that's exactly what sin does. There is an appeal to sin that once we get a taste for it, it's hard to get rid of it. And I mean, so think about the significance of this for God's people today. We can't mess around with sin. Like, we can't leave it in our lives for any length of time thinking, it's not a big deal. I mean, I understand that it's wrong, but I'm working on it. I'm working toward getting it out of my life. The longer we let it sit there, the more it does exactly the thing that it did in Israel and in Judah. So really, I think, significant detail in this history that we should learn from. Yes, sir, Jack.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I think we have to acknowledge also, though, that there were times when the nation of Israel, and even before the division that occurred, there were times when they were faithful to God. So,
Right.
for example, that generation that followed or was part of Joshua's generation was a faithful generation. Unfortunately, subsequent generations were not. But there were periods of time when they had great reform that occurred within, for example, Judah. And some of these periods of reform lasted for generations, but were supplanted with a return to idolatry. But there were times when God's people were faithful to him.
Yes, absolutely. And so in those times, what you had is you had a king, or you had a judge, or you had somebody who understood the past, the problems of the past, and said, we've got to get as far from this as we can. And so there was a tearing down of idols or high places. And a lot of times when those things crept back in, it was because of the unwillingness to completely, or sometimes not an unwillingness, but an inability to completely get rid of the presence of those things within the nation. Phil and Bruce.
Yeah, they were also sad about it when they went into Egypt. God, in his providence, allowed them to stay separate by themselves in the land of Goshen.
Sure.
So they really had contact, but it was a choice to have contact. They were by themselves out there, and so they shouldn't have really been able to partake in the idolatry and the idol worship and stuff. And then when they went into Canaan, he had the same thing. Get everybody out of here. I want you to be separate and apart.
Right.
So it's
Good.
choices they made, even though God had tried to go ahead and get them to stay separate. So.
Okay, good. Yes, sir, Bruce.
I was thinking how the picture in Hosea where God tells Hosea to take a woman of harlotry.
Right.
And that's where Israel was. They'd already had that taste, and then they continued in it. But as Jack mentioned, there were times when she was faithful to him. And then, sadly kept going back to that pattern.
Good. And really, I mean, the risk that God took with Israel, as you pointed out, was Hosea's risk. There was a history already there of idolatry or unfaithfulness at times. God was willing to take a risk with those people and to say, I'm still going to make them mine. It's the same risk that God takes with us when you think about it. God is not coming to people, inviting them into his kingdom who are perfect and cleaned up and have never had problems with idolatry. We're all idolaters at some point, on some level. And yet what God is willing to risk is that his love for us is so compelling that will stir us up. It'll cause us to hate the idols in our lives enough to turn away from them and say, I want a new heart. I want to be a new person. I'm willing to give my life to God. But there is a risk. And I think in that risk, what we see is, on a number of levels, the character of God. His patience, his mercy, certainly his love, his selflessness, to take a chance on people who have this kind of history. Now, let's touch on a couple other things in chapter 23. So, Aholah, the northern kingdom, and Aholibah, the southern kingdom, similar histories, problems, and similar consequences or judgments. The people, the nations that they are most closely identified with in their idolatry or their adultery, Assyria in the north, Babylon in the south, those are the nations that God's going to use to judge them. But look at the picture of this in verses 32 through 34. What God basically tells Judah is, your sister, the northern kingdom, what happened to them was like I gave them a cup of wrath, and they had to drink it until it was all gone. And he says, now I'm going to give you the same cup, and it's a big cup. It's going to be full of judgment and horror and desolation. You're going to drink it. You're going to drain it, verse 34. And then he even says you're going to take the cup, you're going to break it, and you're going to basically eat it and cut yourself open. I mean, it's just, the judgment that is coming on them is so devastating. But that would be the consequence. One other thing I wanted to point out before we get into chapter 24, skip down to verse 38. Notice verses 38 and 39. Again, they have done this to me. They have defiled my sanctuary on the same day and have profaned my Sabbaths. For when they had slaughtered their children for their idols, they entered my sanctuary on the same day to profane it. And lo, thus they did within my house. He references the slaughter of their children, which we know historically as a reference to one of the idols that they worshipped was Molech or Moloch, and they did that by offering child sacrifices. What God points out is they did that, but then in the very same day, what did they also do? Yeah, they went to the house of the Lord. They weren't sacrificing kids in the temple or in the tabernacle. Even like the worst king, Manasseh, when he did that, it was in the valley of Hinnom. Now, he did plenty of other things in the temple. He brought idols and carved images into the temple. But what's interesting here is that they did that kind of in one place, all while thinking that they could come into the temple and, worship God and things are going to be fine. And I think here there's another strong parallel for us. We can't think that God is going to be okay with us living however we want, and then whenever we come into his presence, whether it's here in an assembly or whatever the case is, that as long as we just do that, he's okay with that. I think this is a strong reminder that what God is looking for is hearts that are faithful across the board, without idols in those hearts. Any questions or comments on 23? Yes.
When I read that passage, it made me think that the problem was idolatry, but it was based on a failure to appreciate the distinctiveness of Jehovah. They were worshiping Jehovah in the same way that they would worship these false gods, and they were putting no distinction on the fact that he was the creator, the God of heaven and the God of earth, with whom there is no comparison.
Good. So that's one of the things that God indicts them for, is their failure to realize, as Jack pointed out, his distinctiveness. There are no other gods beside. It was one of the foundations of the nation. You go back to the law at Sinai, no other gods before me. But that was something that they certainly didn't hold to. Another hand over here. Phil? Okay.
And I think the hard part they had was they didn't realize that as a good husband, if you would, that he was taking care of them, and they sort of
Right.
took him for granted, and they went chasing after all this glitter and all these handsome men, all
Right.
this stuff. They looked at somewhere else. The grass is always greener. And I think that's a challenge for us too, is they're looking somewhere else for satisfaction or whatever they were looking for. We can be doing the same thing, going out there looking for something besides what we already have with him. So.
Very good. Yeah, there's a direct parallel. We shouldn't be the kind of people that look for our stability or security in the same ways that the world does. And I think, to your point, that's exactly what they did. They took for granted that they had the security and the stability, but it was from God. And that's where it came from. And as soon as something started to happen that made them rethink that, they'd look somewhere else for it. But absolutely right. Those things ultimately and only come from God in any sort of lasting way. Very good. All right, chapter 24. Chapter 24 is significant for a couple of reasons, but one thing to notice in the very first verse is there's a date that's given. The 9th year, the 10th month, on the 10th of the month. And what was significant about this day, a couple of things actually, but one is that this was the day on which Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem for the final time. So that puts this about somewhere around 588 BC, give or take. But if the city falls in 586 and the siege was about 1.5 to 2 years, then you got somewhere around 588 that Nebuchadnezzar shows up and starts to lay siege to Jerusalem. Now he uses a picture of a boiling pot, which is something that we've seen before in Ezekiel. Tell me a little bit about this pot. What kinds of things are happening to it? What kinds of things are in the pot? What were some of the details that you noticed about that? Alan.
Want to cook in that pot. It was a rusty old pot, so it was a vivid illustration of something, we could have in our mind. A rusty pot, you're going to cook in it, you're going to get a bunch of corruption that's going to come out of the pot.
Good.
So it's
Good. And that was part of what God was going to do, is he was heating this up so hot that all of that nastiness that was in the pot that had no business being there was finally going to be purified. And that's, I mean, if you noticed, as God's describing the fire for the pot, and he just keeps building it, and you're like, that's a pretty big fire for a pot. That's the reason. It's got to be hot enough. It's got to be different enough. And think of this in terms of the judgment of Jerusalem. It has to be different enough from what's happened so far that the rust of the city, spiritually, is finally going to be purified and burned off and gotten rid of. Good. Any other things that you notice, details about the pot and what's going on with it, what it represents? Jack?
Well, in this heating process, there's also a discussion of the blood and the pouring of the blood on the rock. But the rock wasn't going to be covered up with dust. It was as if the blood was going to continue to be visible as a statement, as a reminder, as a message. God wasn't going to allow that to just be covered up and forgotten about.
Good. And another thing that kind of goes along with that is whenever you leave blood uncovered, there's a defilement there. There's an acknowledgement that this place is unclean. I mean, whatever it is that happened here, to leave the place in this condition was a terrible thing. Very good. Bruce.
Well, he also mentions in verse 4 and 5 that everything's in there. There's no separation between the good and the poor pieces of whatever, the meat, everything's in there.
Okay, good. And that certainly seems to be a picture of the judgment on Jerusalem, that when it came, it didn't matter who you were in the city. If you were rich or poor, you were going to be caught up in this. There wasn't going to be any preferential treatment from the Babylonians where they were going to, before they had taken some of the nobles away with them, some of those who in their mind were worthy of converting into Chaldeans or something like that. At other times, they'd been particularly harsh on the leaders and the kings. There wasn't going to be any of that this time. It was going to be unilateral destruction across the board. Very good. Any other observations about the image of the pot? So the city is going to be basically leveled at this point after Nebuchadnezzar is done with it. And then something else was going to happen. Something else does happen on this same day. So that day in 588, the 9th year, the 10th month, the 10th day of the month, was significant because Nebuchadnezzar began his siege, but it's also the day that Ezekiel's wife dies. And what God tells Ezekiel to do here with this, let's just notice this starting in verse 15. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, behold, I am about to take from you the desire of your eyes with a blow. But you shall not mourn, and you shall not weep, and your tears shall not come. Groan silently. Make no mourning for the dead. Bind on your turban, and put your shoes on your feet, and do not cover your mustache, and do not eat the bread of men. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening my wife died. And in the morning I did as I was commanded. That's like one of the hardest verses for me to read, like in the Bible, to be honest with you. I mean, can you imagine being Ezekiel, and however God's doing it, he's saying, hey, son of man, here's your next assignment, here's your next, here's what I want you to act out, here's what I want you to say. And one day God says, I'm going to take from you the desire of your eyes, and your wife is going to die, and you can't mourn. Like when people bring you food, try to comfort you, you don't eat it. You just keep on preaching. I mean, this is a little bit of a side point, but I think it's an important one. Sometimes God asks things of us, and we look at them, and it's really easy to think about the inconvenience of them. Like, why does God really want me to do this? I mean, do I have to go to this extent with how I love my brethren, or how I, treat other people, or how I try to reach out to the lost, or how I use the things in my life? I mean, And you read something like this, and I think it just, it makes you think, how would somebody like Ezekiel respond to me, hearing me talk about all the things that are difficult about my service to the Lord? I've still got my wife. We've still got a place to live. We're in good health. Do you suppose at any point, if you were in Ezekiel's shoes, you'd want to say, I just can't do this anymore, God. Like, everything else you told me, I've been fine with it, but not this, please. I mean, would it be enough to make you want to quit? Is there anything in your life that God could ask you to do that would make you want to quit? And Ezekiel just keeps right at it. I mean, and you gotta think that he was able to do this, obviously, because God had prepared him for the difficulty of it to some extent. He's going to make his head hard as flint. He's going to make him stubborn and resilient. But I think at the end of the day, somebody like Ezekiel is able to do what he does because he understands the value of who God is. I remember where this whole thing started. It started in Ezekiel 1 with a vision of the glory of the Lord that changed everything for him. And I really think that inasmuch as we understand the glory of God and the value of the message that he has given us, I mean, no matter what happens, like no matter what it takes for me to be a Christian, for you to be a Christian, to serve God, we'll be willing to do it because God's worth it. So, somebody like Ezekiel, James 5 talks about how the prophets are examples of suffering and patience. And I think it's a great illustration. If you're going through something hard in your life, Ezekiel can sympathize with you. But I think one of the reasons God gives us this is to get us to see whatever it is we're going through, we just keep going. And we trust that like God's gonna protect his people. He's gonna take care of us. And it's worth it. Alan.
When someone passes, the customs of our society help us through that. The kind of things that we're used to been interrupted by COVID. That had to be tragic for those that couldn't weep and mourn like typical. But when we think about the Jews, they were and are a very outward mourning kind of people. There's times in their history, at least, they hired people, professional mourners, to wail. And when you think about the Wailing Wall that has survived in Jerusalem, we're more of a groaner kind of a culture when it comes to death, and hide our tears or whatever, not let everybody see it. But they're very outward expressive, let it all out kind of culture, and instead you got to keep it in a culture that wasn't like ours at all. So I think we have to picture that too to understand what's going on.
Good. And what God's doing with this is he's using it as an illustration. The reason he tells Ezekiel you can't mourn, you can't eat, you can't, take solace in this from other people is what's happening to Ezekiel is what's going to happen to the people in Jerusalem. The desire of their eyes, the love of their life, the place that they care about more than anything else, the place where perhaps their loved ones still were, it's going to be flattened, and it's going to be so bad that they're not going to be able, for whatever reason, they're not going to mourn for it either. Just utter devastation. And then, at the end of the chapter, one other thing that God tells Ezekiel is after you give them that explanation, like when they see you not mourning and they're like, Ezekiel, what's wrong? Like, what's going on? Because surely they would have known about his wife and would have wondered why is he not reacting as typical. After he explained to them what's going to happen to Jerusalem, God says, and then you don't talk anymore until you get word back from Jerusalem that the city has fallen. Now, I don't think that that means that this was an absolute, like Ezekiel literally wasn't saying anything, because chapters 25 through 32, he goes on and proclaims prophecies and judgments against the nations. But I think in terms of God's prophecy or God's revelation to his people or about his people, it was going to be done until the city had fallen. And then Ezekiel's message was going to turn from one of judgment to one of restoration and hope. Yes, Bruce.
I think also, just kind of my idea here, that God has also now lost desire of his life. He's lost his wife. And he can't, and as you say, Ezekiel's going to be mute, God's going to be mute. God's not going to, he's not going to talk to them for, a while. And Ezekiel can feel the heartbreak of God with what he's dealing with, because, God's done all of this, and they're gone.
Good.
So
by seeing Ezekiel go through this and understanding that the people are going to go through it themselves, they're getting a taste of what it's been like to be, to see this as God sees it. Very good. All right, we just have a few minutes. Let's briefly talk about chapter 25. Again, chapters 25 through 32 are national judgments. Chapter 25 specifically is directed at 4 nations: Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. Of course, Ammon and Moab and Edom were all brother nations to Israel and to Judah. Ammon and Moab were descendants of Lot. Edom was a descendant of Esau. But just to briefly summarize this, what God does in each of these cases when he rebukes them is, what he rebukes them for is, on some level, they took pleasure in the misfortune and the destruction of Jerusalem. Whether it was actively like taking vengeance and going after the people and trying to, kind of jump in with Babylon and fight and kill some of the people, or it was just kind of standing back from a distance and saying, yeah, Jerusalem, it's rough on you guys right now, huh? And just laughing and making sport of it. In some cases, it was people who looked at Jerusalem and Judah and said, they're just like the rest of the nations. Their God's no different from Baal and Molech and any of these other gods. But the point was, on some level, each of these nations rejoiced in or benefited from the desolation of Judah. And God's going to judge them for that. And I think this is one of the practical takeaways of this. We'll talk more just in the coming chapters about how this demonstrates that God cared about more than just his people. But I think practically, this should be a reminder to us of how God views it when anybody takes pleasure in or benefits from the desolation or the spiritual ruin of another person. Remember what God has already said in Ezekiel about the death of the wicked. What did God say his attitude was toward that?
Pleasure in it.
Yeah, this isn't something God does for fun or sport. So when he sees other nations making sport of it or making light of it or taking pleasure in it, it's something that, like, God wants them to understand, you're going to be held accountable for this. And presumably, especially because in the cases of Ammon and Moab and Edom, this was their brother. They should have cared. I'll give you a practical example that illustrates this. A few years ago, I don't know if you guys remember when Osama bin Laden was killed. I don't remember what year it was exactly, but I remember what I was doing when I heard about it. I was watching a baseball game on TV. And the reason I remember that is because during the game, they made an announcement on, at the ballpark. And it was really weird because at first you didn't really know what was going on. The announcers didn't say anything, but you just heard cheers in the crowd. And pretty soon the cheers were getting louder and louder, and it was loud enough that you could tell, just watching the game on TV, that something was going on there. And then eventually the announcers picked up on it. There was a news blurb or a headline that had been broadcast, put on the display, one of the displays at the stadium, that that announced that news. And so everybody was going crazy over it, really excited about it. And I remember hearing that and seeing that and thinking, man, that's great. That's being excited about it. And then I thought about it a little bit more, and I thought, no, that's not that's not how I'm supposed to be feeling about this. Because from God's perspective, I mean, no matter how much damage somebody's done, no matter how ruthless and cruel somebody's been, like, that's just one more person at the end of the day that's going to their judgment, and they're not ready for it. And, like, I understand, I'm not trying to make light of anything here. You know, people get recompense for what they've done. My point is, when that sort of thing happens, that can never be the kind of thing that God's people look at and say, serves him right. You know, like, she got what was coming to her. God makes it very clear that that is his job, that's his role, and he doesn't take pleasure in it. And so we certainly shouldn't either. I mean, what we should be most concerned with at the end of the day is everybody that's on this planet is going to stand before God one day, and it's a sobering thought. And if we take joy in the fact that somebody's going to meet God and answer before him, and they're not ready for that, I think texts like this show us how God looks at that. Any comments or questions from chapter 24 before we wrap up for tonight? Phil?
I think sometimes we take the prophets and we put them segregated because they're at the end of the Old Testament. We segregate them away from the rest of the history of the people. And I think like that date that they put on there, you see that same date in 2 Kings 25.
Right.
The fall of Jerusalem. And you see it in Jeremiah 39. You see it in Jeremiah 52. You know, so this was an actual historical event that happened. We can go back into 2 Kings and say, what actually happened here is the history of this prophecy taking place and what had actually happened. So I think we can put it in perspective by knowing where it places in the Bible.
Okay.
You know.
Very good. Yeah, a lot of overlapping references and ways we can kind of make sense of the time frame there. Very good. All right, thanks everybody for your good comments and questions. Next week, Gardner Hall will be with us. In 2 weeks, we'll cover chapters 26, 27, and 28.